Welcome to the deep dive. Today we are uh, hoisting the sails, so to speak, and setting course for a truly massive, ancient, and honestly often overlooked engine of global exchange, the Indian Ocean trade.
That's right. Forget the overland Silk Road for just a moment.
Yeah, everyone talks about that one.
Exactly. But for millennia, this interconnected seaborne network-shaped civilizations stretching from maritime Southeast Asia all the way, to East Africa and deep into the Mediterranean world.
It's this huge watery highway connecting half the globe.
It's absolutely crucial to understand that we aren't just talking about a body of water here. We are diving into a dynamic, integrated maritime superhighway. It's a system built not by one culture, but by a whole symphony of diverse seafaring traditions.
Like who specifically?
Well, you've got the pioneering Austronesian outrigger ships, these really robust South Asian craft, and then the nimble Middle Eastern dhows. And the true profound impact of this network is that it didn't merely move pepper and silk, you see. It was a massive transmission belt for entire cultures, all the world's major religions, and, well, the rise and fall of powerful polities across the Eastern Hemisphere.
Exactly. So our mission today is to uncover the deep history of this continuous network, really revealing how seaborne commerce fundamentally shaped the geography and the cultural architecture of, well, half the planet. If you really want to understand the origins of globalism, I think this is where you have to start.
Absolutely. And let's unpack the sources a bit. We have evidence stretching back over 4,000 years. It details everything from, the earliest plank-built boats
Wow.
to Roman trade deficits, which we'll get into, and the immense, truly tragic human cost of the trade as well. It's a story about predictable wind patterns, the monsoons, enabling really unpredictable historical outcomes.
A huge scope. Okay, let's dive in. Hashtag I. The ancient foundations of maritime connectivity, prehistory to Roman era. When we look at the historical timeline, we need to go back far before any major empires we usually think about. What are the absolute earliest attested links in the Indian Ocean? And I guess what kind of technology made them possible back then?
Right. We're talking really ancient history pre-4,000 years ago. The sources clearly point to an extensive maritime trade network operating as early as the Middle Harappan phase.
The Indus Valley Civilization?
That's the one, roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE. And this network was connecting the Harappans on the Indian subcontinent with the advanced civilizations of Mesopotamia.
That's a huge distance for that time period.
It's enormous. It suggests a remarkable degree of nautical knowledge and organizational skill already existed.
Okay, and was this trade conducted directly between the Harappans and the Mesopotamians, or was there like a key intermediary, someone who specialized in bridging that gap?
Good question. There were specialized intermediaries, which is fascinating in itself. Much of the commerce during this phase, what we might call, Bronze Age globalism,
I like that.
was handled by merchants from Dilmun. That corresponds to modern Bahrain and Failaka in the Persian Gulf.
Ah, okay. So strategically placed.
Exactly. Dilmun acted as the perfect pivot point, a trusted, geographically strategic middleman. They were known for handling the exchange of finished goods, textiles, foodstuffs between these two massive economic zones.
So if they were traveling such long distances across open sea, what was the tech? I mean, we're not talking about basic canoes, right?
No, definitely not canoes. The feasibility of this sustained long-distance sea trade at that incredibly early date was based entirely on the development of, well, sophisticated watercraft,
Okay.
specifically plank-built vessels. These were equipped with a single central mast supporting a sail, probably made of woven rushes initially, maybe cloth later on.
This sounds like a real step up.
It represented an organizational leap. It meant they could carry large quantities of bulk goods reliably, which makes the whole investment in the voyage worthwhile, you see. Without the standardized production of these sturdy, sail-driven ships, that whole Harappan Mesopotamian link just doesn't happen on that scale.
That understanding of naval architecture must have spread then, because moving forward a bit in time, the sources really highlight another foundational group of mariners who, well, truly mastered the ocean, the Austronesian pioneers. Their network across maritime Southeast Asia sounds astounding.
It is truly one of the most overlooked achievements in human history, honestly. The Austronesian Maritime Trade Network was absolutely vital, and it actually predates much the later trade we often focus on.
Really? How early?
They established deep trade and cultural contact with South India and Sri Lanka as early as 500 BCE. That's quite early.
Wow. And the exchange, I gather, went far beyond just goods. It sounds like it created a kind of bilateral cultural transfer. What specific things did the Austronesians bring?
They profoundly changed the agricultural landscape of South Asia, for one. We see the introduction of Southeast Asian material culture and, crucially, specific cultigens, things that are now global staples.
Like what?
Coconuts, bananas, sugarcane, even certain varieties of rice, all transferred to the subcontinent via these maritime links. They were basically engineering food systems across the ocean.
Incredible. How did they manage such long voyages?
Their expertise was rooted in their distinctive vessel technology. They relied on highly stable catamaran and outrigger boats. These are ideal for long oceanic voyages, much more stable in open water than single hulls.
Right, so pictures of those. Very distinctive.
And that nautical skill reached its absolute zenith with what the sources sometimes call the cinnamon route, connecting Asia all the way to Africa.
The cinnamon route. Okay, tell me about that.
That's where the Austronesian story becomes almost legendary. Indonesian sailors, specifically, were trading spices, notably cinnamon and cassia, directly with East Africa.
Directly. Indonesia to East Africa.
Yes. Their use of vessels like the double outrigger enabled them to utilize the westerly winds that blow across the lower Indian Ocean. It's a complex feat of navigation.
And this wasn't just about spices, was it?
No, not at all. This epic route didn't just move luxury goods, it facilitated one of the most remarkable human migrations in history, the Austronesian colonization of Madagascar in the first millennium AD.
Wait, Madagascar? Off the coast of Africa, settled by people from Southeast Asia.
That's exactly right. It is just staggering when you think about it. People sailed from the area of modern-day Indonesia across thousands of miles of open ocean to permanently settle an island right off the coast of Africa. That journey alone just underscores their unparalleled navigation and shipbuilding skills.
That's mind-blowing.
Precisely. And the proof is right there in Madagascan culture and language today. It remains rooted in the Malayo-Polynesian family, despite the island's proximity to the African mainland. It's a permanent cultural imprint left by an ancient trade route.
That realization leads us directly over to the West, then, where the sheer volume of trade seems to have just exploded with the demands of the Greco-Roman world.
Yeah, the sources really contextualize this Indo-Mediterranean region as the undisputed center of Afro-Eurasian connectivity for roughly 4 millennia, actually, from about 3000 BCE right up to 1000 CE.
So a long, long history there.
A very long history. Now, initial trade between India and the Greek Ptolemaic Kingdom in Egypt was somewhat limited. It started maybe around 130 BCE.
But the real game changer, as you mentioned, was the Roman conquest of Egypt, right?
Yes. The volume absolutely exploded after Augustus conquered Egypt in 30 BCE. It's a night and day difference. The earlier Ptolemaic trade was limited. Strabo mentions they used only a very few vessels.
Okay.
But after the Roman infrastructure was in place, the change was immediate and dramatic. Strabo recorded that when Gallus was prefect of Egypt, as many as 120 vessels were sailing annually from the Roman port of Myos Hormos just to the subcontinent.
120 ships a year. That's basically industrializing the route.
It really is. But what enabled that exponential growth, beyond just Roman organization, it has to be the geography, doesn't it?
Yeah, the ocean itself.
It's the geography, combined with intelligence. Crucially, the massive increase was due to the Romans finally mastering the knowledge of the seasonal monsoon wines, the Hippolytus wines, as they were sometimes called.
The monsoon.
This is the central mechanism of the Indian Ocean trade. The monsoon blows reliably northeast in the summer, allowing ships to sail quickly from the Red Sea across to India. Then, crucially, it reverses to blow southwest in the winter, guaranteeing the ships could return home.
So the predictability is the real economic innovation here. You could invest in a ship and know roughly when it would actually come back.
Absolutely. The monsoon guaranteed a reliable, predictable turnaround time. It dramatically cut travel time compared to coastal sailing, and crucially, it reduced the financial risk of that long-distance investment.
Makes sense.
If you know your cargo will likely be back in 6 months or so, you can finance a much larger, more regular fleet, which is exactly what Rome did.
And this massive influx of exotic Eastern goods apparently generated a bit of a financial panic back in Rome. There's that famous trade deficit issue.
Oh yeah, it became a real political talking point. Pliny the Elder famously complained bitterly about the drain of the steady loss of silver and gold coinage.
How much are we talking?
He estimated 100 million sesterces were lost annually to India, China, and Arabia just to purchase Eastern luxuries and silk.
Wow.
This was viewed by Roman traditionalists as a kind of moral and economic crisis. They literally saw the empire's wealth just disappearing eastward to satisfy the public's taste for, well, pepper and fine cloth mostly.
So what were the specific bottlenecks, the key exchange points on this massive Roman route?
Okay, so on the Roman side, the critical Red Sea ports were Myos Hormos, which was probably Qusair, Equidim, and Berenice, further south. These were the choke points where goods from Alexandria arrived overland, ready for the sea voyage.
And on the other end,
Yeah.
in India.
Moving east, in South Asia, the major hubs were places like Muziris in Kerala, described as a crucial trade center between the local Chera kingdom and Rome, and also Arakamadu, or Poduk, in Tamil Nadu, which was a center of early Chola trade. We know this because of the huge quantities of Roman pottery, amphorae shards, found there.
Archaeological proof. So for all that silver flowing out, what were the Romans actually buying? What was worth so much?
We have the ultimate merchant's cheat sheet, actually. The Periplus Maris Erythrae. It's a 1st century CE text, basically a sailing and trading guide.
Fantastic. What does it say?
It details the inventory pretty clearly. Romans sold, utility and prestige items, glass, silver, and gold plate, wine, coral. But what they were buying, the high-value, low-weight imports, were things like pepper.
The big one.
Pepper was literally like gold to the Romans in value. Also high-quality cotton textiles, silk yarn, indigo dye, and a whole variety of other spices. The saying went that the Yavanas, the Romans, came with gold and returned with pepper. That one commodity really defined an era of trade.
It's a remarkable progression, isn't it? The flow of Roman silver for Indian pepper creates this incredible wealth. And then that wealth funds the movement of people and, maybe more importantly, ideas.
Exactly.
And nowhere is the cultural consequence of the Indian Ocean trade more evident, it seems, than in Southeast Asia, which went through this profound process known as Indianization. Can you unpack that term for us?
Sure. The term Indianization, or sometimes Sanskritization, describes this really deep cultural transformation that took place roughly from, say, 290 BCE right up to the 15th century CE. It was the adoption and, crucially, the assimilation of Hindu-Buddhist influences into the local political and social structures all across Southeast Asia.
Defining what we call the Indosphere.
Precisely. And it's important to stress this wasn't primarily about military conquest, at least not initially. It was much more about the deep diffusion of sophisticated systems, religious, political, cultural systems.
What specifically were these systems that were being adopted? What made them so attractive?
Well, it was essentially a toolkit for state building. Local rulers adopted Hindu and Buddhist concepts to legitimize their power and centralize their emerging polities.
How so?
This meant adopting things like honorific titles, using Sanskrit naming conventions for people and places, extensive linguistic borrowings into local languages, and very visibly, the adoption of Indian architectural styles. You see this most famously in the great temple complexes like Angkor Wat later on.
Right.
The sophistication of Indian legal and religious frameworks like the Hindu-Buddhist mandala system of political organization provided a ready-made structure for turning smaller chieftainships into more powerful regional kingdoms.
So that shift from being just a local strongman to becoming a sort of divinely sanctioned king backed by a complex bureaucracy and religion, that seems like the ultimate motivation for adopting this foreign cultural framework.
It was the ultimate soft power move, you could say. And the drivers were mixed. While trade was certainly a key enabler, merchants brought priests, scholars, texts along with their goods. Religious missions were equally crucial in establishing these ideas on the ground.
And the sources point specifically to one figure, Emperor Ashoka, as an early champion of this outward transmission of ideas, particularly Buddhism.
Ashoka's legacy here is undeniable. Around 250 BCE, his famous Buddhist missions provided a major initial impetus. Tradition credits missions, like those supposedly led by Sutta and Uttara, going to a place called Subakabumi.
Which is where?
It's generally identified by scholars as possibly Lower Burma and Thailand. Ashoka's royal patronage backed these missions powerfully, leading to the establishment of Buddhism as a major royally supported religion in the region very early on.
So the faith traveled on the trade ships, essentially. And once established, did these religious centers become part of the trade economy itself?
Precisely. That's a key point. Hindu and Buddhist establishments became crucial economic entities throughout the early Common Era and beyond. Patrons, often wealthy merchants and rulers, would entrust massive funds to these centers.
Like endowments.
Exactly like endowments. The religious establishments then became managers of these funds, often using them to promote local economies through things like estate management, providing rudimentary banking and lending services, and promoting the craftsmanship needed for the temple's own upkeep and rituals.
Interesting.
Buddhism, in particular, was very effective at traveling alongside trade. It fostered literacy, maybe coinage in some areas, and certainly art styles, all spreading along these maritime routes.
This cultural and economic foundation then paved the way for the rise of these massive maritime empires that focused explicitly on controlling the trade routes themselves. And the greatest early example has to be Srivijaya.
Srivijaya, absolutely. Based on the island of Sumatra and dominating from roughly the 7th to the 13th century, it was the quintessential maritime power of its time.
What was its basis?
It was a Buddhist Malay kingdom whose commercial preeminence rested almost entirely on its geographic luck, combined with naval skill. They controlled the crucial sea lanes, specifically the Straits of Malacca,
The choke point.
the main transit route from India to China. If you wanted to sail east or west through there, you essentially had to deal with Srivijaya, often paying tolls or tribute. They dominated much of maritime Southeast Asia for 5 whole centuries.
5 centuries is a long run. But their supremacy was eventually challenged, wasn't it, by a formidable naval power from South India, the Chola dynasty. Tell us about the impact of the Cholas.
Ah, the Cholas. They reached their absolute apex under Rajendra Chola I, who reigned from 1012 to 1044. This was a dynasty that truly understood naval projection of power.
ISO.
In 1025 and 1026, the Chola navies launched this dramatic and, frankly, punitive invasion. They conquered key Srivijaya cities, including the territory of Kedah, which they called Kataha.
So a direct military strike deep into Southeast Asia.
Exactly. It was a clear message. South India was a major maritime power, fully capable of striking deep into Southeast Asia to protect its own commercial interests against rivals like Srivijaya.
And the impact of this invasion was so significant, I read, it left a kind of cultural scar that lasted for 1,000 years.
Absolutely. It's quite incredible. The Chola expedition made such a massive impression on the Malay people that the name of the Chola king, Rajendra Chola, was corrupted over time into the figure of Raja Chulan in medieval Malay chronicles.
Raja Chulan.
Yes. This is amazing. The legacy of that Chola power is still remembered in modern Malaysia. You find many princely names even today ending with Cholan or Chulan. It's a perfect example of how trade wars, essentially, can become immortalized in cultural memory.
Wow. Okay, so following Srivijaya's decline, we see the rise of another great power, the last major Hinduized kingdom in the region, Majapahit.
Majapahit, yes. Centered on Java, emerging strongly in the 14th century. This was the final great Hindu-Javanese kingdom, and its influence at its peak was vast.
How far did it reach?
It controlled Java, Sumatra, the Malay Peninsula, and parts of Borneo, and the critically important Spice Islands, the Moluccas. Interestingly, they seem to have reverted back towards Hinduism, moving away somewhat from the earlier Buddhist dominance associated with Srivijaya.
Was their control always direct?
Not always. Their influence was sometimes more symbolic or based on vassalage rather than direct administration. For instance, Brunei reportedly paid an annual tribute to Majapahit, but it was apparently just a symbolic jar of areca juice. So, influence varied.
Let's quickly drill down into some specific examples of that cultural integration, just to appreciate the depth of this Indosphere. What really stands out in different regions?
Okay, well, look at Cambodia first. You see this clear evolution from the early Hinduized states like Funan and Chenla straight into the absolutely magnificent Angkor Empire.
Angkor Wat.
Exactly. And Angkor, they founded this powerful state cult that explicitly identified the ruling king directly with the Hindu god Shiva, the Devaraja cult. That's deep integration.
Okay, what about Thailand?
In Thailand, while Buddhism arrived very early, as we mentioned with Ashoka's missions, Hindu influence remains absolutely foundational even today. Their national epic, the Ramakien, is a local adaptation of the Indian Ramayana.
Right.
And the very concept of divine kingship, the idea of the king as a sort of reincarnation of Vishnu, along with many court ceremonies, like the royal plowing ceremony, these are direct Indian influences adopted and adapted for local Thai governance.
And even further east, maybe surprisingly for some, in the Philippines, which often feels culturally distinct today. Are the trade routes still visible there?
They absolutely are. If you look closely, the evidence is quite compelling. You have artifacts like the Golden Tara statue found in Mindanao, which shows clear Indic artistic influence.
Okay.
And critically, there's the use of the Kawi script derived from Indian scripts in the 10th century Laguna copperplate inscription. That inscription itself is just littered with Sanskrit loanwords.
Linguistic evidence.
Yes. And we have historical accounts mentioning Indianized kingdoms like Butuan and Cebu. Even political titles reflect this history. The title Raja Saipad, used by rulers in the Maimbom Principality in Sulu, is thought to originate from the Hindu term Sripada, symbolizing authority and power derived directly from South Asian political models. So this interconnectedness truly stretched across the whole ocean, leaving traces everywhere. Hashtag tech 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 3. The flow of wealth, goods, and power, medieval to European periods.
Okay, so as we move into the medieval period, say after 1000 CE, the trade network seems to shift its centers again, and we really see the rise of Muslim trade dominance across much of the Indian Ocean. This facilitates yet another massive cultural and economic transformation, the spread of Islam.
That's right. The center of gravity, particularly for the lucrative spice trade heading towards Europe, moved from some of the earlier South Indian ports more towards the west coast of India. Calicut, in particular, became the major hub for Indian pepper exports, destined specifically for the Red Sea and then overland to Egypt and onto Europe.
And this entire flow, I understand, was underpinned by one of the most remarkable commercial groups in history, the Gujarati merchant networks. How essential were they? Were they just another group of traders or something more?
Oh, they were far more than that. They were arguably the indispensable intermediaries that made the whole system work during this period. They were logistical geniuses, really.
How so?
They brought spices from the incredibly distant Moluccas, the Spice Islands, and silk from China. They expertly exchanged these for manufactured goods, especially the high-quality textiles produced on the Indian subcontinent, particularly in Gujarat itself.
Right.
And then they sold everything onward to the Egyptian and Arab merchants who controlled that final lucrative leg of the route into the Mediterranean. They managed capital, credit, insurance, and risk across absolutely vast distances and diverse cultures. Truly masters of commerce.
And just as we saw happen with Buddhism centuries before, this powerful economic flow facilitated a parallel cultural flow.
Right. Absolutely. It's a recurring pattern. The diffusion of Islam along the western shores of the Indian Ocean, really taking off from the 8th century onwards, was almost entirely driven by Muslim merchants and the missionaries who often traveled alongside them.
How did that manifest?
Well, they introduced the Arabic script, which became essential for commerce and administration in many ports. And they even brought new staple crops, like certain varieties of rice, to Eastern Africa, profoundly influencing the development of the Swahili coast and its unique blended culture. Islam became deeply embedded in the trading network.
This medieval system, then, channeling spices through the Red Sea ports, handled by Gujaratis, Arabs, Egyptians, and ultimately Venetians in Europe, it seemed remarkably stable for centuries, until the very end of the 15th century when a small European nation found a way around Africa and basically threatened the entire financial structure.
Yes. The arrival of the Portuguese under Vasco da Gama and Calicut in 1497-98 was nothing short of a geopolitical earthquake for this established system.
Why was it so disruptive?
Because by establishing a direct naval route around the Cape of Good Hope, Portugal fundamentally challenged the established millennia-old overland and Red Sea patterns controlled by Venice and the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt.
Oh.
Simple economics. The Portuguese could now bypass all the traditional middlemen, the Gujaratis, the Arabs, the Egyptians, the Venetians themselves. They could buy spices closer to the source and ship them directly to Lisbon, allowing them to drastically undersell Venice in the crucial European spice market.
And the sources indicate that Venice reacted with, well, something close to panic, recognizing this and an existential threat to their centuries-old dominance.
Panic is absolutely the right word. Venice immediately broke diplomatic relations with Portugal. They engaged in frantic, high-stakes negotiations with the Egyptian Mamluk court, trying to persuade them to lower their tariffs on the traditional trade goods just to make the old Red Sea route competitive again.
Did the Mamluks respond?
They did. The Mamluks themselves felt compelled to mobilize a massive fleet in 1507 to directly challenge the Portuguese navy in the Indian Ocean, leading to the Battle of Chal. This wasn't just commercial rivalry anymore. It was turning into a full-blown military defense of entrenched wealth and established trade monopolies.
The Portuguese dominance, though disruptive, was relatively short-lived in the grand scheme, however. By the 17th century, the far more powerful northern European nations, specifically the Dutch and the English, entered the scene. introducing entirely new scales of organization and, frankly, ruthlessness.
That's precisely when the game changed again. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, and the English East India Company, the EIC, entered the fray. And these weren't just trading companies. They operated with semi-sovereign powers granted by their states the right to raise armies, build forts, make treaties, wage war.
A whole different level.
A whole different level. The establishment of the VOC in particular led to an immediate, massive increase in the volume of trade they controlled, and also, tragically, a major expansion and systemization of forced labor and slavery across their networks.
Can we even grasp the scale of the Dutch operations in sort of human terms?
We can try. The sources give some staggering, albeit estimated, figures. There were perhaps up to 500,000 slaves in various Dutch colonies scattered across the Indian Ocean during the 17th and 18th centuries.
500,000.
Yes. And this labor was absolutely instrumental in building the infrastructure required for their trading monopoly forts, plantations, ports. For instance, one specific figure often cited is that some 4,000 African slaves were used just to build the massive Colombo fortress in Dutch Ceylon, which was necessary for controlling the island's valuable cinnamon trade and its ports.
So European trade in this era wasn't just about ships and money. It was immediately and fundamentally tied to slavery and military control from the outset.
Absolutely. This era was defined by intense conflicts aimed at seizing and holding strategic choke points. A perfect example is the 1622 capture of Ormuz.
What happened there?
An Anglo-Persian force, the English EIC, cooperating with the Safavid Persians, combined to expel the Portuguese from that absolutely critical island fortress controlling the entrance to the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz.
Amen.
They immediately replaced Ormuz as the main regional trade center with a new Persian port, Bandar Abbas, under their combined influence. Control of these key islands and straits was the central military objective for all the European powers, as it guaranteed the uninterrupted flow of goods back to Europe.
It feels like the history of the Indian Ocean trade is just inseparable from the history of exploitation. And we really must now dedicate some serious detailed attention to the Indian Ocean slave trade, which, as you've hinted, stretches back across almost every period we've just discussed. It wasn't just a European phenomenon.
No, absolutely not. And it's vital to stress the sheer, depressing ancient nature of this horrific commerce. Slave trading in the Indian Ocean goes back potentially to 2500 BCE.
That early.
Yes, involving the earliest civilizations. Ancient Babylonians, Egyptians, Greeks, so probably on a smaller, more localized scale initially. It became a much larger, multi-ethnic enterprise after the 6th century AD, with the Byzantine and Sasanian trading empires establishing larger, more consistent demands for various kinds of labor.
And even our primary source from the Roman period, that Periplus Guide, explicitly mentions the commerce in human beings, doesn't it?
It does. That merchant manual from the 1st century CE, amidst listing commodities like spices and textiles, specifically advised on trading opportunities in the region, including the morally chilling detail about trading beautiful girls for concubinage.
Chilling is right.
Slaves were already being exported from places like Oman, likely in the Gulf region, westward to the coast of India even then. And the earliest attested export of black Africans from the East African coast areas like modern Tanzania, Mozambique as a sort of constant factor seems to begin soon after that 1st century CE mark.
But the scale changed dramatically with the rise of the organized Muslim trade networks starting in the 7th century, correct? What are the historical estimates of the human cost carried along these routes over the centuries?
The estimates are truly sobering and immense. Historians calculate that perhaps as many as 8 million people were transported from East Africa along these routes, primarily northward and eastward from the 7th century right up until 1920.
8 million.
8 million. These people were moved via key hubs like Zanzibar, various Red Sea ports, and ports in the Persian Gulf. The primary traders involved were Arab and Swahili merchants who captured or purchased Bantu-speaking peoples, collectively known in Arabic sources as the Zanj, often from deep in the interior of East Africa.
And the Zanj. They were subjected to some of the most brutal labor imaginable, weren't they? Particularly in the heartland of the Abbasid Caliphate in Mesopotamia. What exactly were they forced to do?
They were used for extremely specialized, incredibly arduous agricultural and industrial labor. One major use was reclaiming the vast abandoned marshlands of the Tigris-Euphrates Delta near Basra in modern Iraq.
Reclaiming marshland.
Why? This was necessary primarily to cultivate lucrative crops like sugarcane and also dates and other foodstuffs demanded by the growing cities. Critically, they were also forced to work in the brutally harsh conditions of the nearby salt flats and salt mines, extracting salt needed for preservation and trade.
That sounds horrific.
It was. The sheer scale and difficulty of clearing the nitrous topsoil off the marshland to make it arable drove an immense constant demand for replacement labor, as many died from the conditions. Local free Arabs generally considered such hard manual labor demeaning, creating a specific demand for enslaved foreign workers.
And the desperation and the sheer density of this enslaved population eventually led to one of the largest labor revolts in ancient and medieval history, the Zanj Rebellion.
The Zanj Rebellion, yes. It exploded near Basra between 869 and 883 AD, and it was absolutely colossal in scale. It involved potentially over 500,000 enslaved people, but also many free men who joined the cause for various reasons. It lasted for 14 years.
14 years.
Yes. It was brutally suppressed in the end by the Abbasid military, but not before costing, quote, tens of thousands of lives in lower Iraq and fundamentally destabilizing the entire region for a generation. The sheer magnitude of this revolt is a chilling testament to the size of the enslaved labor force concentrated there and the terrible conditions they must have endured.
It's important to note, too, that the trade wasn't just Africans going to the Middle East. It was truly global within the Indian Ocean Rim, sourcing human beings from many different places for different markets.
Absolutely. That's crucial. While East Africa was the primary source for bulk agricultural labor, slaves were sourced from all across sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, and even South Asia for more specialized roles.
Like what?
For example, the Gulf of Bengal and the Malabar coast in India were known sources for eunuchs, who were highly valued in elite households and courts, particularly the Safavid court in Iran. Similarly, Arab rulers and wealthy elites throughout the Middle East sought Circassian and Georgian women as concubines, prized for their fair skin.
So very specific demands.
Very specific. In the 19th century, you see Ethiopian slaves, both female concubines and male eunuchs, being imported specifically into Iran and other parts of the Middle East, showing a market driven by highly specialized and often elite status-driven demand.
And this horrific trade reached its final, maybe its most intense peak in the 19th century, centered on the Omani-controlled island of Zanzibar, didn't it?
It did. This happened when the Omani Sultan, Said bin Sultan, made the very conscious decision to move his capital from Muscat in Oman down to Zanzibar in the 19th century.
Why Zanzibar?
He saw its potential. He aggressively expanded the plantation economy there, especially for cloves, which became incredibly profitable, and also coconuts. This drove the demand for plantation labor dramatically upwards.
Where did they get the slaves?
This necessitated the massive import of slaves, sourced mostly from the mainland territories of modern-day Tanzania, Mozambique, and Malawi groups, collectively known by the Swahili term Mushunguli. Zanzibar became the undisputed, notorious capital of the 19th century East African slave trade, feeding not only its own booming plantations, but also the vast export networks shipping people north to the Persian Gulf and Arabia.
Finally, let's just ensure we contextualize the European involvement in the Indian Ocean slave trade properly. How did it compare to the better-known Atlantic slave trade?
Right. The European-driven slave trade within the Indian Ocean basin was certainly substantial and horrific for those involved, but it was comparatively limited in sheer volume compared to the Atlantic tragedy.
What are the numbers?
Between roughly 1500 and 1850, European traders, Portuguese, Dutch, French, English, moved an estimated 567,900 to maybe 733,200 enslaved people within the Indian Ocean region itself.
Which sounds like a lot.
It is a lot, but that volume was completely dwarfed by the approximately 12 million enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic during roughly the same period. The scale is just vastly different.
Okay. Where were the primary European destinations for slaves within the Indian Ocean?
The main destinations were the French colonies of Reunion and Mauritius in the Mascarene Islands east of Madagascar. They relied heavily on slave labor for their sugar plantation.
How many went there?
They imported somewhere between 336,000 and 388,000 slaves, mostly from East Africa and Madagascar from about 1670 until slavery was finally abolished there in 1848.
And there's a chilling detail about that abolition, isn't there?
Yes. Even after the British formally abolished the slave trade in their territories in 1807, the demand for labor on the French Mascarene Islands persisted. This fueled a vast system of clandestine, illegal slave trading to supply the French planters, defying British naval patrols for decades.
So despite abolition efforts throughout the 19th century, the practice persisted.
It did. And it's important to remember that while European powers largely abolished slavery by the mid to late 19th century, legal active slavery persisted in some parts of the Arabian Peninsula, like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and the UAE, well into the 20th century, only being formally outlawed in the 1960s and even 1970s in some cases. The legacy is long. Hashtag outro. So when we look back at this truly monumental timeline, stretching from those Harappan boats of 2500 BCE through the monsoon-driven Roman era, the great Islamic merchant networks, the brutal age of European companies, and the horrific slave trade, it seems pretty indisputable that the Indian Ocean was, for most of recorded human history, the essential crossroads of the world.
More so than the Silk Road, perhaps.
Arguably, yes, in terms of volume, continuity, and cultural impact across such a vast area. Continuous integrated maritime trade created this shared cultural and economic zone that Indosphere we talked about long before the West ever really conceived of global connectivity on this scale.
Yeah, the scale of that exchange is truly the final takeaway for me. It was the flow of goods, as you said, that defined the wealth and power of empires like the Cholas and Srivijaya. It facilitated the spread of the world's major belief systems, from Ashoka's Buddhism taking root in Thailand to early Islam transforming the Swahili coast. And it drove global consumption, from that immense loss of Roman silver for pepper all the way to the 19th century boom in Zanzibar cloves fueled by slave labor. It just demonstrates the profound, transformative, and yes, often brutal power of seaborne exchange throughout history.
And that profound power, I think, isn't just locked away safely in the past. If we consider how absolutely essential these waterways were historically and frankly still are today as the conduits for massive amounts of global resources, energy, and goods, it raises an important final question, perhaps for you, the listener, to think about.
What's that?
What legacy of those ancient Austronesian, Indian, and Arab maritime routes built initially on the predictable rhythm of the monsoon winds, still shapes the patterns of modern global trade, naval strategy, and the economic geopolitics we see playing out in the Indian Ocean region today? It's a network, you could argue, that has never truly stopped flowing. It's merely changed its cargo and the flags on the ships.